We'll look at some different ways that I've been able to incorporate handbells in contemporary worship, some things I've heard other people do. As I've said in previous classes, I love this to be a class session where we have some give and take. If some of you have come up with some creative things where you found to incorporate handbells into contemporary worship, then please speak up and we'll share some ideas as we go along. Again, my name is Ron Mallory. I'm from up in the Seattle area. I've been doing handbells in the church setting, the school setting. My school group does a lot of pop stuff, kind of like what you just saw there. I've worked in the community handbell choir setting and really enjoyed working in a number of different contexts with handbells. But I also love contemporary church music. I also am the praise band leader, worship leader for my church, lead the contemporary service as well as doing things for the traditional service. And I really am a big believer in contemporary worship being a positive thing for the church. It's something a lot of churches have used to reach out to people and connect with people that probably wouldn't have otherwise gotten connected with the church. Jesus, I believe, has used the contemporary church music to share the gospel with people. So it is really something that I'm very positive about. But I think even though we kind of have this stereotypical idea of what contemporary worship looks like, I want to expand that a little bit this morning and talk about ways we can incorporate some other instruments, including handbells, into that contemporary worship setting. One thing, ironically, I'm going to start off the class a little bit just kind of talking about how do we make the case for handbells in contemporary worship. For some of you, you might be thinking, yeah, why would we put handbells in contemporary worship? If you're here in this class, presumably it's because it's something you want to do. But you might have a little bit of a challenge if you go back and talk to your church's worship leader or pastor and say, hey, we want the handbells in the contemporary service. You might meet some resistance. Well, aren't those really a traditional church thing? What would that even look like in the contemporary service? And I'll mention at the beginning, I'll mention again later, I did a whole series of video resources for Handbell Musicians of America. If some of you are part of that organization, it used to be called AGAHR. If you're a member, you can log in on their website, and they have a whole bunch of documents and videos that are available to members. And I did a series of videos covering some of this material. I'll show you some video clips I put together of handbells in contemporary worship at the church I was working at the time. And I put those together specifically so you could go to your church's pastor or worship leader and say, this is what it would look like. Here's an example of something you can do. So we'll talk about a lot of different ideas today. Ironically, one of the things that we are up against in trying to incorporate things like handbells into contemporary worship is tradition. Contemporary worship has been around long enough now. My church I grew up at started contemporary service in 1991, which is almost 30 years ago. And over 30 plus years of contemporary worship in churches, there are kind of certain patterns that churches have fallen into, certain expectations people have with contemporary worship. Certain traditions, ironically, that have developed within the contemporary worship movement. And I think that's why a lot of churches, you'll notice, have stopped calling it contemporary worship, and they've shifted to the term modern worship. And I think that's specifically because a lot of people come into contemporary worship with a set of expectations, but as our worship life continues to move forward, they say, hey, yeah, we're not doing 80s, 90s, 2000s contemporary anymore. What we're doing now is kind of different from that. So we're calling it modern worship just to sort of help establish a new set of expectations. But yeah, it's kind of funny to me that one of those traditions that we see is in attire. Anytime you go to suburban megachurch contemporary, you've always got the worship leader, often the pastor, dressed kind of. Where's my kids? I've talked about them in the previous section. Dressed kind of like this. This is Chris Tomlin, right? Plaid, untouched shirt, blue jeans. That's kind of the new robe and stole. It used to be, you go to church, the pastor's going to be in a robe and stole, the choir's going to be in choir robes. This is sort of the new version of that. In fact, true story, a bunch of us clinicians went to dinner last night, and a bunch of guys were sitting around a table, and someone observed that every guy at the table was wearing some variation of a blue plaid shirt. And one of the other guys said, well, it's a Baptist music conference, what do you expect? So that's kind of, like I said, that's become the accepted attire for contemporary worship. That's just sort of what you expect to see. A few years ago, I was at a conference where David Crowder was leading worship, Baylor graduate, And he was dressed a little differently. He was looking kind of like this. This is his new look the last few years. And as I visited other churches' contemporary services the last couple of years, I've started to see a little more of this look. This is kind of, a look that's popular among millennials, and that seems to be becoming a new established standard, maybe, for modern worship. So who knows, maybe in a few years this will be the new version of a robed stole. But we have these sort of certain expectations that we come into contemporary worship with, and that leaders have in contemporary worship, and that works its way into music as well. I was at a conference a few years ago with some members from the church I was at the time, and one of the keyboard players from the praise band went to a session, I didn't go to it, but they went to it, called The Role of the Piano in Contemporary Worship or something like that. And she reported back later that the leader of that class was a guitar player, that should be your first red flag, who started off the class saying, well, the guitar is really the main instrument of contemporary worship, and the piano's job is to support what the guitarist is doing, and then went and taught the class from that basis. I thought, why is the guitar the instrument of contemporary worship? And I think a lot of that is because churches started their contemporary services back kind of in the 90s, was when contemporary worship really took off. And a lot of secular rock music at the time was very guitar-driven. In the 80s it was all synthesizers, in the 90s it was very guitar-driven. It's kind of shifted in the 2000s and the 2010s a little bit, but a lot of churches got stuck in that tradition of contemporary worship equals acoustic guitar. 90% of the time that's what you see. So when we're coming in and saying, hey, we think we should incorporate handbells, we're going to be fighting against that mindset of, but contemporary worship equals guitar, bass, keyboard, and drums. That's what contemporary worship is. Just like, in decades past, we would have been fighting against, worship equals organ and choir, and that's it. That's what worship is. So, the contemporary musicians sort of had to fight against that trend, and now we sort of have to fight back against the new traditions of contemporary worship. But I think one argument we can use against that is to get back to our mission as a church, and the reason a lot of churches went to contemporary worship in the first place, which is an acknowledgement that in decades past, 100 years ago, a lot of people had some church experience in their background. A lot of people had at least grown up going to church. So if they come and visit a church, if someone invites them to a church, they're going to sort of know what hymns are and what a pipe organ is, and they're going to expect a choir and robes and that sort of thing. But as culture has changed over the past decades, we see fewer and fewer people who grew up in a church environment. So if as an adult you invite them into a church environment, it's going to be a little unfamiliar with them. So one of the goals of contemporary worship is let's put them a little bit more at ease by giving them a musical style that maybe they'll connect with a little bit more quickly. So that was why there was an effort to copy some of what was going on in contemporary rock music and bring that into the church setting, and that's something that continues to mature and to evolve. But again, if we go back to, hey, if contemporary Christian music is supposed to be sort of looking to contemporary secular music for our style cues, because that's one way that we want to connect the gospel with culture, well, let's take a look at what's going on right now in secular pop music. So back in the 90s, it was very guitar-driven, but over the last, in the 2000s, especially in the 2010s, we've seen a lot more piano, we've seen a lot of other instruments starting to get weaved into secular pop music. I want to play a few examples. One of them goes all the way back to the 1960s, actually. The Beatles, of course, did some creative things. So what instruments do we have there? String quartet, right? So this is a piece for string quartet and tenor soloist. So does that make it a classical piece, or is it a rock song? I don't know. I mean, I personally love music that kind of defies those nice little genres. But the point is, people have been using other instruments in rock and pop music for decades, really. But it's really taken off in the last 10 years or so. Most of the examples I have are from a few years ago, since that's when I first put this set of class materials together. But here's the band One Republic. Cello.
I need another story, something to get off my chest. My life is kind of boring.
Again, something you might think of more as a classical orchestral instrument, yet here it is being used in a pop setting. I've appreciated, that we've seen cello, strings, violins, incorporated into the worship sessions we've had with the praise band. I think that's very healthy that we're starting to incorporate those other instruments. Here is a Sarah Barry Ellis song from a few years ago, Show Her She's the White Brass. Trumpets and the trombones going in there. Not something you typically think of in a pop song, but incorporating it, if you watch the video, it shows her with all the brass players around her. There was a song this was like the #1 iTunes song from a few years ago by the group Gautier. Again, really unusual instrumentation. A marimba. Flutes in there. Yeah, marimba, flutes. Again, this is not your typical guitar, bass, drums instrumentation. This is kind of a landscape of modern pop music. So, now that unusual instrumentation is starting to be kind of an expectation there, why shouldn't we take that into the church setting, since that was the goal of contemporary worship originally? So how do we include handbells in this? A few years ago, I was looking up something about handbells on YouTube, and I think I just typed in handbells at the search bar just to see what would come up. And the top couple of results were a band called OK Go. OK Go, you might know from, they kind of got known for doing all these crazy music videos. This was their first big viral music video hit where they're dancing on treadmills. They've done things in weightlessness. They've done things with huge groups coordinating. But it turns out they incorporated handbells into some of their live shows, and there were some clips of it on YouTube, so we'll switch to that here in just a second. Their technique is terrible, so don't look at their technique. But hey, here's a rock audience being exposed to handbell music. They are again at some sort of outdoor music festival, it looks like. There you go. There's a big rock audience that's listening to handbells. So we can officially add handbells to the list of interesting instruments, unusual, what you don't usually think of as rock or pop instruments being incorporated into the pop music sound spectrum. Does anyone else know of other pop groups that have used bells? There probably are other ones out there. And like I said, this list could be a lot longer of groups that are using what you don't usually think of as traditionally rock instruments. So I think this is one argument we can use to say, hey, if the goal of contemporary worship is to create a kind of a sound world that people without a church background are going to feel more comfortable being invited into, so that we can use that to communicate the gospel to them, well, hey, this is the sound world right now, is much more unusual instrumentation than we had a few decades ago. So I think we can take advantage of that to incorporate handbells into what we're doing. Another argument that I like to use for it is that as music leaders, part of our job is to be good stewards of the resources, the musical resources that God has given us. And if you've got handbell players in your congregation and your church is doing primarily contemporary worship, I think it's important to say, hey, how can we take those gifts and those abilities and incorporate them in what we're doing? I was talking to some people at lunch that I was at a church once where as I was kind of surveying, what people's gifts were, we had a ton of saxophone players. So we did a season where we did a whole bunch of saxophone music. I would have saxophones playing with the praise band. We would do saxophone quintets and quartets and things. So I thought, well, that's who God has placed at this church right now, and they're there with a heart for serving God with those gifts. So, hey, I'm going to try to open up the door for them to do that. So if you've got handbell players in your congregation, let's try to open up as many opportunities for them to contribute as possible. So here are a few specific ideas I want to go through for how you could possibly incorporate handbells into a contemporary service. Some of these are going to fit really well in certain settings and not at all in other settings. One is that there are lots of handbell arrangements out there of contemporary worship songs. So if that's, it'll be a nice plug and play version for you. Lorenz and Hope Publishing in particular have done a lot of just, the latest Matt Maher or Chris Tomlin or Hillsong or whatever that you can just buy and learn as an arrangement. So, that's kind of what we're used to doing as handbell choirs. So that would be a really nice, easy plug and play for you to potentially do something as a special music at the contemporary service. And again, it depends on your context. In some places I could see that working. In some places where you have kind of more of a harder edged contemporary sound, something like that could come across sounding like elevator music. It could not be as well accepted. I do have a clip I want to play of a group up in the Seattle area. I asked Ruth Brewster, the director of this group at Bellevue Presbyterian, if I could play this clip. This is them playing the song Mighty to Save with their praise band at their church. And actually some of these arrangements have band parts so that you can actually play with the praise band. So here's a little idea of what that could look like. There's an example of what it could look like if you're playing kind of one of those off-the-shelf arrangements. Ruth did ask me to point out too, this was actually recorded at their traditional service. They occasionally would have, they're a church that has a traditional service and a contemporary service, but they occasionally look for ways of connecting the two. So this was actually their traditional service where they invited some of the praise band musicians to come in and play this piece with them. So I could see something like this being a really great fit if you're a church like the one I'm at currently, where we do a traditional and contemporary service, but every couple of months we'll combine together and do a single blended service. This is a way to sort of bring the traditional and the contemporary together. I think there are way too many blended services where it's, the praise band does some songs, they go off stage, the organist does some hymns, goes off stage, and you're not really blending anything. You're just sort of incorporating both parts separately. So this is a great way to make that kind of connection. There are also a lot of original handbell pieces out, again, as publishers have kind of realized this need. I wrote a piece a few years ago that's available through AGHR Publishing called Contemplations, and John Benke, the handbell editor, said, this kind of sounds like it could work in a contemporary environment. What if we put chord symbols above the handbell part? And that way, a guitar or a keyboard or bass or something could play along if they wanted to incorporate it in a contemporary service. So there are some pieces like that out there that are designed to kind of work in multiple settings. So, as you're looking at new releases from handbell publishers, you can watch out for those kinds of things. Again, depending on how contemporary or the style of your contemporary service, that may or may not be a good fit. Idea 3 that I think works really well in any setting is Christmas music. even people who are like full-on, rock and roll, contemporary worship people, all of a sudden something flips in their mind the day after Thanksgiving. I've always just sort of, been baffled by this, but there's a big Christian radio station in Seattle. It's called Spirit 105.3, and all year long they're playing, Chris Tomlin and Matt Redman and Hillsong and all this kind of thing. And then from Thanksgiving through Christmas, they renamed themselves Spirit 105.3, and they're playing old Burl Ives recordings and the Vienna Boys Choir, and stuff that they would never even consider playing the whole rest of the year. A lot of people, even if they're total, rock and roll people, they love traditional stuff at Christmas time. So this might be a great kind of foot in the door to say, hey, at Christmas time, could we bring our handbells in and play Carol of Bells or something like that? People are going to be much more receptive to it. Even if that means you only get to play in your contemporary service 1 month out of the 12, hey, like I said, it's a place to start. I want to play just a little bit. Some of you might have seen this. This is a number of years old now. And it doesn't actually involve handbells, but it's kind of cool. There was a North Point Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Some of you have probably seen this. This was right after iPhones and iPads had been released, and they actually are using like handbell apps to play at their service. Again, a very contemporary church, but sort of incorporating handbells in a funny way in a Christmas setting. No reason you couldn't do this with, digital background with real handbells, too. Maybe this is the way some of you incorporated contemporary worship. Hey, I've got my digital handbell app. Like a year after iPads came out, so it was still kind of this novel, cool thing. Having apps in it. Anyway, so there you go. So, but it gives an idea of people. They would never play Carol of the Bells in any style ordinarily. It's anything involving handbells, but for some reason, Christmas time is okay. Joel Rainey's here this week, of course. This is a piece of his I really love that incorporates percussion and keyboard parts. Anyone played this arrangement? It's stylistically, I think it's something that could fit into a contemporary service well, especially at Christmas when people are going to be more receptive to something like that. Something like that, I think, could be, especially at Christmas time, a church might be open to including something. We'll move on. We'll focus most of the rest of the class on how do you actually create parts for handbells to play with a praise band. I'll show you some examples of that, and then I want to actually put some things together. And if we have time, we can even sing together a little bit at the end. Did all of you get handouts for this class?
No.
I have just a few copies here. They dropped some off earlier, I thought. I don't know where I have just a few extra copies up here, but you brought in a whole stack of them earlier, and I don't know where they ended up.
Are these them?
That's for the previous class.
Let me go check real quick.
Yeah, I've occasionally had handbell players, either a full group or just a small ensemble works really well, playing along with the praise band. Like I said, a number of years ago, I made some videos of some of the things that we had done for handbell musicians in America for their website, just to kind of give people some ideas to get them started. You can do it with a soloist, you can do it with a small ensemble, a full choir. I was talking to someone at a conference last year that said she's done it with a bell tree, where you have one player just kind of playing some little melodic parts and accents over the top of the praise band. So here's one example. So this is, we actually recorded this after church, and everyone kind of looks tired because we've just been through the whole church service. But to give you an idea, when we get handouts, I have a little chord dictionary for you, which shows like all the notes for the chords if you were writing out a part for a handbell choir. So literally what I did, and I should say on these videos that we did, we used contemporary versions of traditional hymns just to avoid having to pay copyright fees. But these approaches would work just as well with any praise song too. So I literally just took the chords off of the chord chart and wrote them out in whole notes for the handbell choir to play along with, and they're just kind of following along with the chart. When there's a G chord, they play a G chord. When there's a D chord, they play the notes of the D chord. We added some echoes in at one spot just for some variety. It's going. Most of you now have this chord dictionary. Again, we'll look at some chord charts later, some lead sheets.
Is
Is it this one right here?
No, it's the other one.
Should be one.
Okay.
I was gonna mention something too.
Yeah.
I think it's Celebration Hymnal that we have. It's actually an addition for handbell.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, I have not seen that.
Okay, yeah, it's just
So make a note.
back in the day, I think it's the Celebration one I was thinking of. I have it, I just can't remember if it's a Baptist one, but I think it's the Celebration. Yeah, and it's an entire edition just for handbells, and so you could do the reverse if you had, them play out of the handbell, like you had before. You could have the undergirding of the band, they could add on or add different flavors to it. You did the opposite way. But we have that, we've used it, and how we use it, thank you, is to add to the worship whatever other instruments are playing. We just play with them
Sure.
on the hymns.
But you know, a lot of praise bands will do kind of contemporized versions of
Yeah,
hymns.
yeah.
Some hymnals will include usually some older praise songs, but
Right.
you know, that, again, that might be a place to start.
Yeah, it's a place to start.
Yeah,
It's
thanks.
very Catholic.
I'll have to look for that.
Right, yeah.
I have a couple of other videos of some different setups. So this was with a full handbell choir. Again, you see the chords there, literally they're just playing whole notes. The only difference is we added the echoes at the one of the a cappella section just to kind of give a way to change things up a little bit. Here's some different versions with a small ensemble and soloist. So here's one soloist just playing a few individual four-in-hand notes. You can do this with Mallory. And you should, as you get in the handouts, you should actually have a copy of the lead sheet that we used for this that has the chords and then the notes. We'll talk in a minute here about how to pick which notes will fit with which chords and so forth. But this is what we used for that video. And then the last one, which you should also have, is Holy, Holy, Holy. Here we arranged a little ensemble part, which could be played by a few ringers. Part that uses handbells or something, and a couple of people who do four in here. Again, kind of bringing the bells in just for certain choruses, certain sections to kind of add some accents. Looks like the audio and video are up to date for some reason. Again, the goal here with this was to take what the praise band was already doing and just figure out how can the handbells come in and kind of slide into that and accentuate what they're doing. You know, we're trying to support the praise band in their, you know, their work that they're doing and not coming in and sort of taking over. So like I said, if you're a member of Handbell Musicians of America, and if you're not, you should be. But they have a lot of member resources, and all those videos are available in there, just in case you wanted to show those to your pastor and say, hey, this is kind of what we're thinking of doing. You know, that gives them a visual to say, oh, okay, maybe that could work. Just really quick, because this came up in one of the earlier classes too. If you're arranging a copyrighted song, ordinarily you need to get permission from the copyright holder. But if your church has a CCLI license, which is the license that allows you, just a blanket license that allows you to use contemporary Christian music, and you pay an annual fee, it is included in that I think it literally says if no arrangement is available that fits your instrumentation, then you're entitled to make your own arrangement. And since there aren't really any arrangements like this out there, that covers doing this kind of a thing. You know, if you're doing other contemporary music in the church and doing arrangements, you need to go get permission for that. But this kind of thing is covered under the CCLI license. Any questions on that or anything else so far? Let's actually take a look and do some arranging here. I'm using a program called Finale. I was using this in the composition class for those of you who were there for that. So let's actually take one of these and do something different with it from what you saw. Let's take Holy, Holy, Holy. And again, for putting those videos online, if we were using like a Chris Tomlin song or something, we would have had to get clearance to use it in the online video, which would have been separate from the CCLI license, which is why we just did, you know, an arrangement of a public domain hymn. But this kind of approach would work with anything. So let's take a look here at Holy, Holy, Holy. I always find it's easier to work with a lead sheet, which is where you actually have the notes written in and the measures and so forth. Some praise bands, again, just depending on the style and how they like to do things, sometimes they just have the words with the chords written over the top. But again, if you have the CCLI license, if you have the kind of add-on option called Song Select, you can download lead sheets for most contemporary songs. I just find, especially if you're not as familiar with the song, it's helpful to know, you know, how many measures each chord goes with and kind of how the melody rises and falls and so forth. And you don't always get that from a words and chords only version. But these are, you know, pretty easily accessible if you can look for it. So here's Holy, Holy, Holy. Let's look at rehearsal A here, measure 5. What's our first chord? The D major chord. So if you're, you know, less familiar with chords, you can look over at your chord dictionary that you have there. Right. Getting into the theory of how chords are built is a whole other class. We covered a little bit of that this morning. But this is just kind of a nice cheat sheet for you. So a D major chord is what 3 notes? D, F sharp, and A. Let's say we want to arrange a part for 2 handbell players. So first of all, we need to be in the key of D. 4/4 time. So let's say we want to do 2 handbell players. We won't do any 4 in hand, so we're just going to use 4 notes. For starters here, let's just do whole notes. And I find, you know, especially when you're playing with a praise band, honestly, the bass bells kind of get covered really easily. So it works better if you're going to use just a small ensemble to use kind of, you know, treble clef range. So we'll focus on doing more of the higher bells. So we'll start with something really simple, and then we'll kind of play with it and try out some different sounds. So the next measure, measure 6, is what chord?
A.
A major, which is which 3 notes? You look at your dictionary there. A, C sharp, and E. You can do them in any order, any inversion, especially up in this range. Doesn't have to have an A on the bottom, so I'm going to do these 3. Next measure, G chord, which is which 3 notes? G. All right, G, B, and D. And then the next measure is back to a D chord, so there's our D, F sharp, and A. So there we go. Can I have some volunteers who are up here? So let's see, we ended up with more than 4 notes here, but. Well, let's get, if we can get a C6, D6 player, E6, F6. Let's do this with 4 players. So if we can get the C6, D6 through the B6, C7 position covered, if I have 4 volunteers to step up, just C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, C. And then maybe we'll try to simplify this down to something that can be played by 3 people, 2 people. If people are capable of 4 in hand, obviously you can do it with fewer. So you'll need C sharp and F sharp. So we're starting with C sharp, 6, D6, E, F sharp, G, A, and then just the B. So try playing it as written. Let me see if I can zoom in a little for you here. Okay, so there's your 4 notes. Here we go. And C. Here we go. So let's add a keyboard here. Here we go. I'll do a 4-bar intro. Something that would work. It's pretty simple, pretty basic. Let's see if we can make it a little more interesting. We can just kind of change up the rhythm even a little bit here and there. Let's try that. Here we go. Starting right at rehearsal A. Everyone else can sing along if you've got the sheet music in front of you, or you probably know this hymn anyway. Rehearsal A. Are you ready? Go. Playing with some different rhythms. Let's see if we can simplify it down to just 4 notes here. Maybe just take out a few in the middle. So all the other notes, the other notes of the chord are going to be covered by keyboard, guitar, so on and so forth. Sorry. So there we go. So now we've just simplified it. And again, the goal here is to show you can do this with a full group, you can do this with 2 people, you can do this with 4 people. So let's hear the 2-person version now. Here we go. Right at rehearsal A, 3, and go. But again, it still works depending on how many people you have or how much. Some praise bands, again, it depends on your situation. Some people might be a little more open to, hey, could 2 of our handbell players come and do some little accents, as opposed to our full 13-member 5-octave choir wants to share the stage with you. Again, if you're anticipating some resistance, that could be a little bit more palatable for some people. Let's try to simplify this down to something that 1 person could play. Certainly someone, who can do 4 in hand could do the C sharp B in one hand, the G and the A in the other hand. But let's just take some notes of the chord. We'll simplify it down into this would have to be a 4 in hand part. It'd be hard to do it with just 2 bells. I guess you could get like a tonic and a dominant and do just some accents. Any of you up there do 4 in hand? Just kind of taking what we had before. Just doing something similar, but just spreading the notes out a little more, since 1 at a time. Again, something like this could work on a bell tree if you held up the 4 bells on a bell tree and played with the mallet. Here we go, rehearsal A. Ready? And. Maybe you work it out to where bells just play on the chorus, or just the first verse, or just the bridge, or something. Let's try having the whole front row stand up. Everybody find a position. Take out your chord dictionary. Those of you in the back row, we don't have enough to cover all the bells, but you can find a position there too. Take out your chord dictionary and have your holy, holy, holy music next to you. This will be a challenge in how quickly you can look back and forth. But the chords move slowly enough in this song. I'm going to play through with a little slower tempo. As you're playing through, you can actually look over at the chord dictionary and say, okay, D chord, look over where the D chord is written, and see if you have a note there. Next measure, you look over where the A chord is written, so just kind of, eyeball where the chords that are used in this song are located. We have a G chord, back to a D chord, back to an A chord, and then we have a B minor and E minor, so those are down with the minor chords in the lower section. Let's see if we can play through this for now with everyone just doing full notes. So when you get to the D chord, if you play in that chord, go ahead and play your note. Get to the next measure where there's an A chord. If you play in that chord, go ahead and play with that note. And you'll have to begin, kind of get used to looking back and forth. But I do know of another handbell person who also does praise band who said that she actually does this with her group, and they even use their praise band just uses the words and chords version, and they just literally have one of these next to it, and they say, oh, G chord, and they can play, and A chord, and they can play, and they just kind of play off of something like this. So, like I said, that could be an option.
I just write the letters out,
Or you could do that too.
G major D.
Or you could do that too, yeah, is literally just take this and write C, F sharp A, A, C sharp E, G, and then if you have one of those notes, then you play that. So let's try this at rehearsal A. And we'll go a little bit slower just to give you a chance to navigate back and forth here. Here we go. One. So right at rehearsal A. 1, 2, 3, and go. Like I said, scale it down to just a few people, one person is what each one. Take a look at Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing.
We don't have.
Did you not get that one?
We don't have that handout.
There's a big stack of them up here. Maybe that's maybe they brought those in earlier. Also in the key of D, on the recording, we did this with a soloist, so we literally just took 4 bells, since the soloist could do four in hand. We took the A, D, E, and A, and in each measure, we just had her playing individual notes that fit in with that particular chord. So we switched to the A chord. this one with the chord dictionary, and then we'll kind of play around and try some different arrangements of this one. On the chord dictionary, you'll notice too, these are just your basic major chords. Some pieces will have like a C major 7th chord or a D7 chord or something like that. These basic major chords will fit into those. Most of those chords are your basic chord, like a C chord with a note added, or a C chord with a 2 added. But the regular notes in the C chord will still work. The one time that won't always work is with a suspended 4th chord, which is where they take the 3rd of the chord, the middle note of the chord, and raise it up. Although it's becoming more and more common to have the 3rd and the 4th both in the chord, and getting this sound, so you might be able to get away with it. 20 years ago, that would have been a bizarre sound, but hearing both of those together is becoming kind of a trendy sound now. So let's try Come Thou Fount with everyone playing the full chords here. Go ahead and play right on the intro. So just you're ignoring the little italic notes about where it says band enters and that correctly. So right on the intro, 3 beats per measure, still in the key of D. Here we go. 1, 2, and 3. 2 chord, 2, next measure, D chord again, 2, another measure, D chord, 2. Certainly work to do the song that way. Go ahead and have a seat. Let's look at some arranging we could do on that one. Yeah, speaking of using the major chord and the sus chord together. I remember reading years ago in a theory book, it said that for those of you who know the theory terminology, that the minor ninth was sort of the last dissonant interval, that all other intervals had kind of become, our ears become so used to it, but a minor ninth, which is that interval, that's a C up to a higher C sharp or a D flat. That's actually in the Psycho movie, that's the interval they use They said that was the one interval that still sort of sounded unpleasant to people. And that's why you would very rarely hear the major chord and the sus chord together, because you have that interval. But I've been hearing pop songs a few years ago. There was an Adele song. Hello from the other side. I heard that and I thought, oh my gosh, there it is. The last dissonant interval is no longer dissonant. There's that psycho interval that now is in mainstream pop music. So like I said, you can get away with playing those two together now. So somebody call out, do we want to do a quartet, a trio, a duet, a soloist? What kind of part do we want to put together? Beltry? Somebody pick one. Quartet. All right, so let's say, so we're going to limit it to 8 bells. So let's say maybe from this A up to this A. So we have an A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. That way we keep it to kind of the standard bell assignments. So starting, if we have the handbell start at rehearsal A, where we've got a D chord. I'm going to do kind of like I did on Holy, Holy, Holy. On the version that you saw in the video. If you notice what I'm doing, I'm playing between, within our parameters of just using 8 bells. I'm putting all the notes that I can put in of the D major chord, and then I'm alternating the lower 2 notes and the upper 2 notes. Everyone see what I'm doing there? That's a pretty common accompaniment figure in a lot of handbell music. So that's something we know will probably work pretty well. So let's do the same thing with the A chord. And let's try using the regular A chord and see what that sounds like against the A sus. We have a G chord. So again, if you don't know your notes as well, you can look at the chord dictionary to figure out what they are. So G, B, and a D. And here, because we're trying to keep it between the A and the A, I'm just using a 3-note chord. And again, you just kind of experiment with different patterns and different combinations of notes and different rhythms. That's what I do as a composer, just to kind of play around until I come up with a pattern that I like. And this is just one that I know often works. And then we've got that same pattern, so we can just cheat a little bit, copy and paste. So let's have a quartet have 4 of you up on the A5 through the A6 position, so A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, A. We can get a different group of 4 up too if we want to spread it around a little bit. And we'll consider that there's an LV in every measure. So once you've played your notes, you just let them ring till the end of the measure and then damn them. You don't play the next one. Let's have the 4 of you do this pattern as an intro to the song. So here we go, 3 beats. 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2. Here we go, now rehearsal A. Handbells, every bell sing to my heart to sing my praise. Strings of words sing, bells sing, all songs of praise. Good, so that sort of works. So any questions or thoughts on this process? This is just kind of showing you what I've done when I've incorporated handbells into a praise band, and hopefully it gets some ideas from you. Ideas, or again, if there are other things that you've seen people do, I'd love to give some other ideas too. We still have a few minutes left, so we can use our last little bit of time in question and answer.
One song that comes to mind that I've used is the song Believe with the digital age, which has a lot of reverb in it in the recording. So we used singing bells at the beginning, and we just did the singing bell as then the band came in, and then we used chimes instead of bells, so that we have just LV chimes so it was more of a full sound, more of a pad sound, I guess. And
Yeah, if you're trying to, a lot of, praise band songs, or if you listen to a recording, it'll start with what's called a pad, which is where the keyboard player is just like holding down, sometimes just a single, note on strings or something,
and the singing bells give you that effect.
And exactly, that'd be a way that the handbells could contribute that. Other thoughts, other ideas? We've got in our reading session later, for those of you who will be at that, I've got a couple of contemporary songs in there too that we can play through. I'm fine finishing a few minutes early. Yeah, go ahead.
So depending on the song, meloding can be real effective. It's more like a percussion thing going on. And
Yeah,
we do a lot of world songs, which aren't real contemporary necessarily, but it works well with that. Yeah.
Percussive effect. Yeah, I in a praise band setting where there's so much percussive stuff going on already with the drums, I kind of feel like the bells might get covered. But hey, like I said, try just about anything. Yeah, other thoughts, other ideas? So let's go ahead and wrap up a couple minutes early then. Thank you all for coming. Again, hope I got some ideas going for you, and I hope you'll go back and try this. I'm hoping in 5 or 10 years, handbells and contemporary worship, we won't have to offer a class on it because everyone's just doing it. It's kind of an acceptable thing. So,
Thank you, Ron.
thank you.